Madarame's palace collapsed, we've got some time to kill before his formal change of hearts. Thus, Ryuji Mishima, having found a flyer for a maid cleaning service, wants to try it out and see what it's like to hire an all-services maid. Look, unless it involves dragon maids, a certain character voiced by Yoko Hikasa, or either Kaori Kanzaki or Mikoto Misaka, finally getting into the legendary fallen angel maid outfit in an attempt to seduce Toma Kamijo, I'm really not that interested. Hell, this ends up going bad for them, as the maid that they end up hiring through this service happens to be Sadayo Kawakami, previously introduced as Ren and An's homeroom teacher, who on complete accident played her own part in jumpstarting the protagonist's story.
我は汝、汝は我。汝、ここに新たなるちぎりを得たり。ちぎりはすなわち、囚われを破らんとする反逆の翼なり。我、節制のペルソナの生誕に祝福の風を得たり。自由へと至るさらなる力とならん。
The Temperance Arcana Confidant is open to us after this event, by immediately on May 28th of the year, finding Kawakami in the school building being chewed out by fellow teacher Miss Chono about her lacking commitment to her job as an educator. And that reason for such, as well as the sheer exhaustion I have pointed out since the beginning of the game, begins to be known, due to her having to work 2 jobs to make ends meet. Now, like in America, Japanese educators are actually properly paid. Maybe not what they deserve, but they're not so badly funded they have to buy school supplies out of pocket just to have them in freaking classes, as far as I am aware. Seriously, the American educational system has been so sabotaged by Republicans, it's astounding anyone learns anything, since they don't want people to. But the reason, as is revealed through her Confidant storyline, is a former student of hers named Takase was worked to death by his selfish guardians, who had initially demanded he work for them the second he was of legal age to hold a job in Japan, as high school education and beyond is a completely optional pursuit in the country, in order to repay them for the kindness of housing him after the boy's parents had died themselves. The guardians using that money to fund their own hedonistic lifestyle that made it so they themselves wouldn't have had to work anymore. But because the boy didn't want to be his guardian's wage slave for the rest of his life, Kawakami did her proper job as a teacher and had been helping him take back his own agency by tutoring him in her own time for him to improve his grades and earn his graduation certificate in order to leave that abusive situation behind, only for Kobayakawa to learn of it and demand she stop doing such for a delinquent, regardless of the reasons he was failing his courses and was absent to begin with not being his fault, and said principal would have earned more prestige for his school by helping such an outlier instead of dismissing them. Because with Kobayakawa, it really is all about image, not act. It's made people question why he wasn't shown to have a palace or distortion worth correcting, but let's face it, he's not distorted. He's just a spineless toady. Not every person who is evil has the sense of morality twisted or locked up. My initial question of this ended up more along the lines of, why didn't the Guardians want Takase to get a good career before trying to insist he pay them back? But on rumination, I came to figure that ruining his prospects at a better job in life was the point. So he would always be forced to be dependent on them for shelter, so he'd have his wages so stolen he'd never be able to move out and become independent, due to how bad housing costs in Japan are. Sometimes things like this just require a little thought for it to make sense. But tragically, all the jobs Takase's guardians forced him to take caused Takase to suffer from karoshi, literally dying from overwork, with this taking the form of him dying in a car crash he was too tired to avoid. His guardians had blamed Kawakami for the loss of their income, and have ever since been extorting money from her on the grounds that if she didn't pay up, they lied to the school board and claimed she was having an inappropriate relationship with their ward. Which in turn ties back to both what I discussed earlier about criminal reporting of sexual assault and the abuse of minors, and also why I don't consider Kawakami as a legitimate paramour option for Joker, as if it had happened with Takase, the Guardians wouldn't have grounds to make a statement to the police without the individual themselves making the statements. But they sure as hell would have been able to make Kawakami's life hell and dragged her name through the mud enough to cause her to lose her teaching certification at bare minimum. As that is a civil issue, not a criminal issue at that point. And the sad reality is, there are far too many parents and guardians out there that regard their children not as people, but their property. This is actually having become more commonplace with time in Japan due to the population decline the country has suffered, to the point it has more and more seen spotlight as abused in popular media. And I'm not just talking Persona examples. That's also the backstory to Iruma Suzuki in Welcome to Demon School Iruma-kun, where his parents are so abusive and hedonistic that they sell him to a demon lord, and him being taken away by said demon is the best thing that ever happened to him. That is the second time I've mentioned this series in reviews this year. Please check it out, it is really fun and wholesome. But yeah, her being X'd out of the paramour options for me is because, despite Ren hitting a status of being of age by the time they'd ever reach any point of consummation, which, again, does not actually happen in this game, just the accusation of impropriety by these jackasses have done nothing but ruin Kawakami's life. And their selfishness is reaching the point she herself is risking death by exhaustion as well. While saving her from that as we do, it's shown that the Guardians were more than distorted enough to warrant intervention by the thieves. The circumstances that even brought her to this point are more than valid enough to traumatize her against possibly getting her into a relationship with a student or younger man. Thus, having a player insist on it and getting her to cave into agreeing, it feels wrong. It feels like we're forcing her to submit to this in exchange for having freed her from this hell. And that any love might end up conditional even if that was not intended in the depiction of events inside the game. This not helped that the maid service Kawakami worked for, yeah, it has two divisions. The actual maid service arm she was in, and the full service arm that adds on full-out prostitution onto the table. And due to her being in her late 20s, aka beyond marriageable age by Japanese standards for some stupid cultural reasons, she wasn't earning enough work from the former to be able to stay out of the latter for much longer. Thus again, it has that rent-a-girlfriend vibe to it where one can't get past the idea that we bought out her contract to own her love, which is just a different form of prostitution. I don't believe Atlas did that deliberately. If you exclude her as a paramour option, you don't get that context at all. Merely the protagonist deciding to help someone that is desperate enough in exchange for the help they themselves need. Hell, it's only by bringing in parallels to material that exists outside the story itself and making assumptions about character actions, it would seem so negative. But as I have been presenting, media does not exist in a vacuum, and sometimes the idea of impropriety is all someone wants. Even if one goes that route and has Ren pick her as a paramour, that's still something that would hang over the relationship. For if you look at them as people, not as characters, that would be something very difficult for them to work past. But again, as was my original condemnation of the toxic fandom on this, they took this the wrong way and claimed it was the elder woman who was pedophilically victimizing the protagonist and Atlas was promoting such malicious grooming. When that never happens, and the claim itself is slander due to the context of her Confidant story, which one would even need to witness to get to that option. For that ignores the role Kawakami's associate arcana plays on this. For Temperance is the alignment that pertains to frugality, living by the minimum of what one needs to stay mentally and physically healthy, while in reverse, it effectively represents enslavement, either to a religious sect or other institution where one loses all agency over themselves. And to be a positive force in the universe, a wildcard is not going to force an arcana to invert itself. Thus, while one could take away the wrong viewpoint from the dynamic between Ren and Kawakami, it really is more about helping her free herself, and permit her to live her own life again, simply by providing the absolute minimum of comfort and a safe space in an unforgiving world by which to recover, and she can provide that in turn, matching that of her Code Geass character parallel of Sayoko Shinozaki, Lelouch's personal ninja maid, that made it so much easier upon him to care for his sister. Though even she made mistakes that helped lead him to his eventual end. For she provided many of the same forms of support in that story that Kawakami does. Though amusingly, it is neither the first or last time that Kawakami's voice actress Mai Fuchigami has ended up in a maid outfit when their role specialties lie elsewhere.
Taxi!
But why you need to trigger her confidant as soon as humanly possible is because of the reward it gives you. The gift of time. When we have the money for it, we can hire Kawakami after classes as part of her maid gig to not only help her ward off the extortionists in the short term, but gain assistance in completing tasks Ren would otherwise be stuck doing himself, such as brewing coffee or making thief tools for infiltrations, which all use periods of time for Ren to do himself. By having Kawakami do them instead, that frees up Ren's schedule by which to improve the character's social stats, have him take part-time jobs that can lead to connecting with other confidants, or find new targets, or even develop the dynamics by which to build up or completing the blood oaths. Not only that, she allows us to do things in classes we otherwise wouldn't be able to do, such as use that time to build thief tools ourselves, or, more importantly, read all of the books Ren can collect throughout the game, which are one of several ways you can have available to level up Ren's social stats. We literally would not have this advantage without her. And most critically, by obtaining a blood oath with Kawakami, we unlock from her a full body massage, which can be used after metaverse infiltrations to be able to use the same period of time we did those metaverse trips in to do something else as well. This was a game changer for players in every respect, making Kawakami the single most important confidant in the game, bar none, and the highest priority one to complete as fast as possible once it unlocks, because of how truly invaluable that is in giving us every possible extra day before we even hit the midpoint in the game. Like, the tedium of Persona's schedule management has been the bane of many players, and yet, here it is, Atlas giving the fanbase a built-in cheat to earn back some time. And all it takes is handing over what money one can until one maxes out the Confidant. As once one does, Kawakami's services become free, as we freed her from her own personal hell.
あとそうだ。これも言っとかなきゃね。君、噂の怪盗なんでしょ？伊達に長く生きてませんから？安心して。バラすつもりなんか全然ないし。いろんな評判あるけどさ。怪盗団は私みたいの助けてるんでしょ？最初は前歴ある問題児とか思ってたけど、一緒に過ごしてきた今なら納得できるんだ。私応援する。君は単なる生徒でもお客さんでもない。教師としての道を築かせてくれた子だもん。どんな生徒も見捨てない新しい道を。我は汝、汝は我。汝ここにちぎりを血明の絆へと転生せしめたり。絆は反逆の翼となりて魂のくびきを打ち破らん。今こそ汝、節制の究極なる非王に目覚めたり。無尽の力を汝に与えん。
As we wait for Madarame to come clean, Shujin hosts a community service day for the school in the final day of May, which when you're playing Royal, leads us to having a fateful encounter with one of the new characters made accessible in Royal, who I've mentioned in passing before, Yoshizawa, as she's accosted by a dirty old man trying to pick her up, which is all sorts of wrong.
どうして助けてくださったんですか？助けたいと。あ、変なこと聞いてしまってすみません。先輩も清掃活動ですよね。
Yeah, scenes like this would be so much more effective if the protagonists were allowed to actually have a voice. Again, Atlas got Jun Fukuyama for this. Why wasn't he allowed to actually act? Still, the greater cleanup event places a spotlight on why I just like the cast integration on this game far more than the others, as we actually see relevant cast members actually have chances to interact before their actual relevance to the story. So it acts as us getting to know them before their points of relevance alongside the ones we're already connected to. Whereas in Persona 4, their side events were not terrible, but were overly focused on just the main cast with maybe inclusion of one of the comedic foils to make things messy. We didn't really see much of other relevant cast member interactions in much of those, so they came off as more isolated. That doesn't make Persona 4's use of such bad at all, far from it, but it shows how the storytelling of the franchise has evolved over time, so people we should be getting to know are not just brought in at random to become relevant at some arbitrary interval. By seeing them earlier instead, we know who they are. And it's because of this event that Yoshizawa gets to have a more private moment with Ren to thank him, leading to her connecting as an Arcana.
我は汝、汝は我。汝、ここに新たなる契りを得たり。契りはすなわち、囚われを破らんとする反逆の翼なり。我、信念のペルソナの生誕に祝福の風を得たり。自由へと至るさらなる力とならん。
As we learned from her ID card dropped during this event, Katsumi Yoshizawa is a year younger student at Shujin, recovering from the trauma of losing her twin sister with the help of Dr. Maruki, the counselor that Shujin hired to help deal with student trauma in the wake of everything that happened with Kamoshida. She and Ren bond after Sumi showcases her gymnastics talent, Morgana commenting that the natural agility she displayed would be good for him to learn in order to better dodge enemies in the metaverse. And in the terms of game mechanics, that ends up translating to improvements to HP and SP to better survive attacks and cast spells, alongside additional gymnastic abilities such as tumbling out of the path of shadows in order to avoid being surrounded by them in battle, which can give those shadows free attacks against us if such happens. So the workouts with her are an overall improvement to our efforts. Scheduling these workouts and other interactions with her also assist in Sumi's efforts to get over her ennui, which has been a detriment to her own development as a gymnast in the wake of her loss. Her trainers wanting her to take a break and think about who she is on her own now, but Maruki has been the one to encourage her to work through her own grief however she can, though that has only acted to cause Sumi to have random attacks of anxiety when she didn't before. Ren in his own way does help her improve by giving her a means to ground herself again, but the problem is Sumi's a perfectionist, and if she doesn't do things right the first time, she is overly hard on herself, which is a component to her anxiety, and why she's in a slump as she just works herself into such a frenzy that she doesn't always consider how to improve or what to do in the moment, both as a gymnast and in other matters. To the point that sometimes when she looks in the mirror, she doesn't quite recognize herself in comparison to the person she wishes to be. If anything, her traumas cause her to suffer from a case of imposter syndrome, as if she doesn't know who she wants to be without her sister in her life anymore. All we can really do in the end is help her feel at home in her own skin again, make her see her for herself, and seek to improve day by day however she can. Now, unfortunately, half of Sumi's Confidant is locked up until we hit the post-story extra chapter that was added in Royal, as her continuing development is more tied to that, with an exception to an event we'll get to that occurs in October. And I felt that was a fair balance, as this way such would only occupy 5 units of time in the schedule, and not subvert our efforts with trying to complete hers over that of other essential characters that factor into the main story, which she does not. With Royal removing the need for a player to make gun ammunition, and then taking a hell of a lot more time than both what Sumi and also Maruki's Confidants would take up, it was a fair trade-off. But as consequence of both of them being new addition characters, they are also exempt from consideration of whom among us is the traitor. We clear out more distorted shadows in another trip to Mementos, only to just see the plain oddity of the shadows of people patiently waiting in line to board the trains down. What are they being ferried to, one wonders? Well, that's tabled for now, as the next arc of the game starts up. Madarame putting together a press conference to announce his crimes and be taken into custody, which is broadcast to the nation. And in doing so, start to see the idea of the Phantom Thieves into the popular consciousness. But the continued unsubtlety of Ren's companions, alongside our new association with Yusuke, has gotten Makoto's suspicions riled, as in an investigation, there's no such thing as a coincidence. A line of thought that Sai in the flashback scenes is also pursuing in the continuing case of psychotic breakdowns affecting government employees. As to her, the changes of heart of Kamoshida and Madarame are just too similar to the random personality reversals that the breakdown victims are suffering. One is an attack of conscience, the other just being overwhelmed by blind rage or gaps in memory. Now you'll forgive me for not including more examples of the psychotic breakdowns that Sai is looking into. A lot of the news reports of odd incidents, quite frankly, just flow into each other. Or you have to be in the right spot to overhear passerbys talk about them if you're not near a TV, or hear a news report while you're out doing the other activities. Which is pretty frequent and metaphorical for real life, where you don't always hear about essential news that can affect you. As they are still happening all over the place, we're just not directly related to them enough to know, and some just blend into the normal crazy nonsense of life. Many of the headlines just sounding like the Japanese equivalent to Florida Man stories, but obviously with a Japanese twist to them. Hell, that clip I just pulled up as an overlay, that first headline actually factors into later, and the second one is alluding to the story arc we are just entering. But you just don't think about it having any relevance, so you don't remember it, even though it ties into everything going on. That is subtle storytelling. It's evidence that the Black Mask's activities are behind them all. But because Sai and Makoto are not aware of our methods, they are confusing these creation and destructions of distortion with just straight up drugging a victim. Neither are considering actual mind manipulation as, well, you kind of have to work one's way up to accepting the supernatural. Hell, in the flash forward, Sai is still having trouble accepting that herself. That it has to be more conventional means, when it really is not. Granted, even her director thinks that's too much of a leap in logic back in the flashback. But of course he'd want to discourage that line of thought simply because it put her too close to the truth of what the conspiracy he's part of is actually doing. Especially as she's gotten down a likely timeline of how long this has been going on. The Black Mask's distortions having been done over the course of the last 2-ish years. But that's context for later. In the short term, Ryuji had an idea and introduces a new side game to us. Dart throwing. We work in tandem with other members of the cast to play darts and hit the target scores. And in doing so, we get upgraded bonuses to baton passing with them. And that bonus stacks the more you have cast members it's been improved with. If you chain baton passes around the entire group, the damage multipliers can get nuts. Unfortunately, there are three caveats to the minigame. The first is you're playing with an NPC, meaning half your score is out of your hands. The other is the minigame is a bit dependent on the controller's motion sensitivity for where you hit with a dart. Fortunately, if you manage to get high scores in a small enough number of turns, you can actually encourage the NPC player of the game in the right time, so they will on the last throw get a perfect score. The difficulty to this is just getting the needed score low enough with the throws you control for them to have the last round instead of yourself. Completing the scoreboard in 2-player mode is what levels up the baton pass rank, and like everything else, you need to do this in the bare minimum amount of detours to doing it possible so it doesn't mess with the other events in the schedule. Certain party members only partner up with other specific players, so one needs to wait until they're around to actually do it in the limited days you have available to doing it. It is an achievable minigame, and since Ren can trigger the circumstances of a baton pass really easily, it does pay to come play darts with the cast when the windows are right to do it. For it is a positive reminder that we're in this together. And to that end, that segues us into a politician that embodies that very concept.
我は汝、汝は我。汝、ここに新たなるちぎりを得たり。ちぎりはすなわち、囚われを破らんとする反逆の翼なり。我、太陽のペルソナの生誕に祝福の風を得たり。自由へと至るさらなる力とならん。
One of the more easily missed confidants and arcanas is the Sun, represented by Torinosuke Yoshida, and is voiced in Japanese by Keiichi Noda, who is best known for voicing Tetsuya Tsurugi from Mazinger, Cyborg 002 Jet Link, and the Decepticon Overload. We first encounter him back in the first playable week of the game, as he gives speeches to the people in Shibuya Square, where a bunch of Tokyo rail lines intersect. And in my collection of Code Geass parallels, Torinosuke can be best represented by Taizo Kirihara, who similarly in Code Geass's canonical backstory mentored Lelouch for a time following his exile to Japan, before becoming relevant again in the first half of that series as a man publicly disgraced by working with the Conquerors to maintain their personal power, but privately was one of the financial backers of the resistance seeking to thwart the domination of their overlords, and one of the most progressive members of their group. Regardless of that parallel and only considering Persona 5's content, however, Torinosuke is a magnificent orator with deep-seated beliefs and convictions, but due to his past, no one will listen to what he's actually saying. After Kamoshida confesses, Sojiro begins to allow Ren to leave the cafe at night, permitting him to take part-time jobs in the evenings. While the other two jobs made available for Ren to work permit the Phantom Thieves to learn of the crimes of other distorted individuals, spending some time fulfilling orders at the Beef Bowl restaurant Torinosuke frequents allows Ren to build a rapport with the man, so he will seek to recruit Ren to assist him in giving his speeches. And through them, we learn of his disgrace, and why he has lost re-elections to Japan's government for years, despite all those speeches being things that are generally progressive, good, and messages any normal person should agree with, and should want a politician to properly pursue. But we rarely see progression of, thanks to conservative special interest groups blocking them, or demonizing those who don't know any better against them. For as is the condemnation, conservatism consists of exactly one proposition, to wit, there must be in-groups who the law protects but does not bind, alongside out-groups who the law binds but does not protect. And that is basically what happened with Torinosuke. The political party he was part of framed him for campaign finance fraud in an effort to shut him up and avoid punishing the individuals actually responsible who were going to be up for succession into political office, forcing Torinosuke to resign in disgrace because his ideals and working for the people rocked the boat too deeply. Again, had there been a proper investigation, he would have been exonerated of any wrongdoing and such charged against the properly guilty party. But as is so common in politics, the optics are everything. All you need to be seen doing is something the public does not agree with, and can scuttle your career regardless of guilt. If one actually bothers to pay attention to politics, and I can understand if you don't, but you should still participate if you ever want to see things ever get better, we've seen that a lot as of late, which has helped this game over the last 7 years retain an insane level of relevance that has been part of why it has come to age like wine, where the idea of impropriety is enough for a politician just trying to do their job to get death threats as a mob is directed at them. That when someone is actually criminally liable for things they've done wrong that have broken the law, their supporters do everything to deflect as they think they would benefit from it. Yet if there is a legitimate accusation and evidence against them, just charge them. From there, the truth should come out in a fair system. That should be a non-biased, non-partisan position. But as we've also seen, the justice system itself is rigged to favor those of a conservative political alignment and punish those not part of it. So there isn't even faith in the idea that someone will be judged fairly due to how many people have gotten away with high crimes, even treason, because their party protects them and calls such the fairness of law, when it is anything but. This game's entire narrative is built off of the abuses of the law to punish the innocent, reward the corrupt, and maintain such a status quo, and how you have to smash that and expose the greatest sinners for who they really are to break the apathy of the people that allows such a system which abuses them to continue. And in his own way, Torinosuke is a microcosm of that art because of his history, and by his speeches all directed to galvanize the people, regardless of his reputation, regardless of whether they support him, regardless of if he ever obtains political office again. As honestly, despite his disgrace, that doesn't matter to him. What does is doing the right thing and encouraging others to do so themselves. The man is more than content with where he is and doing what he is now, only striving for office again just to help the people that he can. But he can do that no matter where he is as well, matching his Sun Arcana that regardless of whether it is right side up or reversed, it represents fortune and contentment, that one will persevere no matter what struggles, as long as one strives to be and for better, as the sun will always rise once again.
自分が変われば世界が変わる。それが天の道。
It's why when toxic fans try to say that Persona isn't political, has no presence of topical politics, I can't help but ask, what the hell do you think this is? Because this is politics. This game has a political message, relevant even beyond the Japanese audience it was originally written for, and in context to their political landscape. And I've been saying what it is. A system of governance that does not work to represent the best interests of the people is corrupt and must be reformed by taking out of power those that only consider what benefits solely themselves. This should not be so difficult to understand, yet it is for so many that deliberately blind themselves to there being a problem, or are made to believe someone else other than the historically guilty culprits is supposed to be responsible. And again, you can't say it's not, as even in this game, we're already seeing that with Sai's part of the plot, where she's being misdirected, and the criminal parties are going to start using that against her and us very soon to cover up their own crimes, by which to lead into the circumstances that form the game log framing device. To say that there are no politics here is to deliberately admit that you did not pay attention. And because of Ren's help, he does begin to throw off his bad reputation, ultimately coming to just outright say that even if you don't support him in specific because of his past, is anything he said about what can improve things for them all actually wrong? That they shouldn't try to put into positions of power not just those who make empty fleeting promises, like that asshole bald guy from before, but people who are shown and have a track record of agreeing with their own values and have an idea of how to make things better in the long term? As every politician is inevitably going to break their promises. They are not kings. Their word is not binding law. There is a process to everything, and because humanity has divergent views on everything because of free will, not everyone will agree. But when you have popular support for something and you only put in office those people who have long screwed you over and refuse to do any actions that would better your lives, show they never intended to keep their promises to begin with or those promises were bad for you from the start, then those who continue to put those people in office have no one to blame but themselves. And as a last tangent to this, back in 2020, the representative for my congressional district was a race between a known pro-corporation liar who had worked to obfuscate everything about himself to make him seem as the perfect candidate, and a guy who it turned out had forgotten to pay a few parking tickets a decade before. Now, me personally, an individual that has a history is more real to me than someone who tries to hide who they are. And something like forgetting to pay a parking ticket, that's relatable. That showed a sign of how biased our criminal justice system can be, where they criminalize some for benign matters, but ignore more serious offenses. Hell, I've got a ticket not for breaking the law, but via entrapment by an officer turning off their vehicle lights at a highway at night, so I'd move to pass them out of a concern for safety. After which, me speeding up to do so in the passing lane was all they needed to do to ticket me. So I wasn't going to fault that candidate for such when the one I got was fraudulent enough in circumstances even the judge I saw over the matter was skeptical it was warranted, as that specific officer had a history of doing that even though it was against the law. But that candidate having such themselves was enough that it swayed the vote against him, as it implied he was more of a lawbreaker than the rest of his history told. So my district is still overseen by someone who does not represent the best interests of where I live, even though the town I live in widely voted against him. But that's the cost of me living in a state that has been gerrymandered to hell. So Torinosuke's speeches resonated a lot with me in his simple declaration of even if you feel you can't trust the messenger, at least try and support those who have shown to believe in the message. Or nothing will ever get better, as those who obfuscate who they are will always stab you in the back. And when that facade finally breaks and you peer through the mask they disguise themselves behind, then believe what you see beyond the mask is the truth of that person, and stop supporting them if they do not align with what you believe in. As you are not to blame for the lies others tell you, only the consequences of if you still continue to support them past the point the lies have been exposed. For supporting Torinosuke through all of this, however, you get to learn from his general life experience and skills as an orator, which again is hilarious in context of the protagonist just being a transparent XP of Lelouch, what with his various examples of speechifying. And as you rank up the Sun Arcana, his lessons in diplomacy pay dividends by making it far easier for one to enter and succeed in negotiations with rogue shadows, for either recruitment or them giving us the bribes we ask for. Either way around, it helps to deal with the issue I most had when starting out my negotiations, breaking down with even common shadows, let alone the rarer ones we'd need to find to complete the Persona Compendium for the twins. And it's a good sign to work alongside an honest politician for once, even with Torinosuke's baggage, especially considering the one out there that acted to ruin Ren's life.
頭皮不正流用の真犯人が倉本の親父だってことを週刊誌にスクープされてね。親父はこのまま政界引退だろう。もう時効なんで警察沙汰にはならないが道義的責任があるからな。孫の弁蔵君も離党届を出したそうだ。松下が掛け合ったか、それとも党の罪滅ぼしのつもりか。あとは私の実力が試されるばかりだね。無実の罪によく耐えたと応援してくれる人が急増しているらしい。そんなつもりはなかったのに。20年間いろいろ苦しい思いをしたが、今度の選挙で清算できそうだよ。私の推測の息を出しない話でもあるからね。それを前提に聞いてもらえるのなら、今は仕事に集中したまえ。そういう時期だ。私は政治の王道を目指す。別の道を行く君のことを思いながらだ。だがもし君がその道で困ることがあれば、いつでも力になろう。世の中を正そうとする同志として。
我は汝、汝は我。汝ここにちぎりを血明の絆へと転生せしめたり。絆は反逆の翼となりて魂のくびきを打ち破らん。今こそ汝、太陽の究極なる非王に目覚めたり。無尽の力を汝に与えん。
私はある若者に出会いました。彼は私と違う方法ながら世界を正そうとしていました。それは途方もなく大きな山です。私は彼と歩くことはできませんでした。ですがさよならは言いません。頂上で会うはずだから。彼はやりたいことを必死でやっています。皆さん、やりたいを見つけてください。私が支えます。それが私のやりたいことです。
Moving on, Sai's boss informs the conspiracy that Sai might end up onto them, putting even further pressure on Kobayakawa to find who the thieves are, if they even are at the school, which makes Kobayakawa pass that unsubtle threat onto Makoto, dispensing with the carrot and trying to hammer down the stick with their respective lack of progress. But she's lacked any progress explicitly because, while she has likely suspects, there's no evidence beyond hearsay. And more than that, the Phantom Thieves helped the school by exposing Kamoshida in the long run, which is her largest hang-up, as while they went around the process to do it, it's very clear to her that no one who had the power and was in a position to do anything was doing anything. But the conspiracy makes clear they're trying to hammer obedience into this group with dragging the affected classes out to a talk show, where they have as a guest the new detective prince Goro Akechi, who exhibits himself in his own ego a bit with expositing on the clear criminality of the thieves. How could they force such a despicable confession from such an innocent man? This acting to do nothing but undercut the evidence Madarame presented of his own criminality, which Akechi brushes off as inconsequential, despite that evidence being worth more than the confession to begin with. And he knows that. The portrayal from Akechi itself, selling how really naive one can be towards how people can throw up a public face, and yet still be a slathering monster underneath, despite such being a common thing exposed by criminal investigations, especially the specific nature of the crimes that he usually solves for the police. His condemnations, however, ring more hollow and empty and more than a bit hypocritical in the wake of the reality that his own investigative powers are extra-legal themselves. While he may work alongside the police, he has no proper right to investigate and gather evidence in the way he does independently of police action. More expansion on his casework later, revealing he'd usually find that one piece of cinching evidence to close the matter for the prosecution, as if this were a Murder, She Wrote episode. But even in those, there's a clear way to reveal or connect a chain of evidence handling that would present such as being on the level and not possibly forged. As hell, even Naoto Shirogane, the previous detective prince before, obviously her actual gender became more publicly known and that title got changed, more worked off of deduction and surveillance to bring additional information and ways of looking at a case in order for her to help the police she worked with to solve them, which would lead to questions of evidence tampering through which to have a case thrown out, as that is something more to question with Akechi's presented methodology. It's only because Akechi's good with the press to have a positive public image and works with Sai that such probably isn't happening, though probably more for the latter than former come to think about it. Though beyond that, Akechi doesn't seem like that bad a guy, as during a run-in with him the previous day, he'd expressed his own appreciation of pancakes when Morgana had gotten the group into a conversation about them in an open hallway. I mean, how can you hate a guy that appreciates pancakes? I actually make really good pancakes, though I don't get to cook them as often as I'd like. Though we're not the only ones that end up having encounters with Akechi during this, explicitly thanks to the conspiracy in their own ways trying to recruit Makoto as well.
回答は悪で、あなたが正義？
勝手に人の心をいじってるやつと比べれば、少なくとも僕は正義の側にいる。それに僕は自分に備わった才能を使って世のために奉仕しているに過ぎない。
Yeah, about that. We will be discussing Akechi's Confidant story later when he becomes more involved in things, as there's more critical matters affecting the student body that should have their attention first and foremost. That being, several students informing Makoto of their classmates being forced into working for a criminal after being blackmailed into servitude. It would do more to redeem the image of the school, as Kobayakawa publicly seems to want, if they were to drop the boot of police intervention on such an extortionist now, than waiting until the situation is untenable as they did last time. But of course, Kobayakawa cannot do that, because the individual in question, one Junya Kaneshiro, is a mafia boss and black market broker who is involved with the conspiracy as one of their financial backers and accountants. And because of his part in their schemes, he views himself untouchable by the law due to how deeply the conspiracy has invested the greater Tokyo Police Department and legal system. And while it is never directly confirmed, it is a popular fan theory that Kaneshiro was the broker through which Madarame sold his forgeries of the Sayuri painting, as Madarame is later revealed to be among those who are backing the conspiracy as well, to have such a bridging connection between them and the creator of Distortions. Or at least, I think that's what was going on. I could not find the line of dialogue in the game that confirmed it either way, but it is said to be so on the Shin Megami Tensei wiki. Then again, the wiki could itself be mistaken, as like all wikis, it's fan-created, and some sections of it are a bit obtuse regarding some details of Persona 5 as well, such as the timeline and the backstory, which is self-contradictory on that itself. As it does even bring up the perception filter effect that is seen all game long, or the process by which distortions are seeded into the palace rulers and other targets. It just describes their shadows as escaping one prison only to drop themselves deliberately in another, due to later story events. But that explanation contradicts the process by which we see palaces form in the game, as the regions they themselves dominate, and also how the jails in Strikers are created, and what purportedly imprisons them, not taking form until later, so that explanation leaves behind a form of chicken and egg paradox, where it can't happen the way it is claimed, as the one who would have done so did not yet have the power by which to do it, and only was able to start out by acting through a proxy that did seed the distortions which would grant it power. We are like 4 videos out from beginning to discuss that just yet, but that's one of my other complaints about the late end of the game, where audiences just take the word of a self-deluded dumbass as gospel, when one of the points of the game is explicitly about how it's impossible to control everything, and its version of events actually causes the game to make less sense. Now, as I said at the beginning of these reviews about the portrayal of Makoto, her English voice actress Chirami Lei did not manage to sell many of her scenes, which in turn made Persona 5's toxic fanbase turn against the character en masse, while Makoto's Japanese voice actress Rina Sato more than does so. Key to that being how ever since the character's introduction, Rina has subtly put into her voice Makoto's frustration at being strong-armed by Kobayakawa into doing all of this, and forcing her to ignore the suffering of actual people, as if she's being told who and what is just in contradiction to her own morals. Whereas Chirami just doesn't. Her depiction coming off as more whiny and condescending than it should have, and that likewise playing part in the Western misconception of Makoto being worse than she is. And again, I more place blame on the voice she used for the character in the English depiction of Makoto on the matter, alongside their respective direction, and Chirami is not a bad actress. I have no idea if the English dub's director asked her to use that voice, or if that was what she felt fit for it, but again, as I mentioned in part 1 of these reviews, it would have been better for her to have used the voice she did for Kudelia Ina Bernstein in Iron-Blooded Orphans in her portrayal of Makoto, as that fits the character more. It's less of a miscast, more of the voice used acting in conflict with what would have been best for the depiction. But if I were to be arrogant enough to claim anyone that might have done better out of hat, I would be biased in the favor of saying voice actress Brittany Karbowski. And that would be for one simple reason. Makoto Railgun Misaka. As for those who are not aware, Rina Sato also voices the Raildex franchise's lead heroine and Electromaster alongside Brittany, and that inevitably has bled over into Makoto's depiction in several ways, thanks to that being the same voice Rina uses for the character here. Thus, for individuals like myself who have engaged with the Raildex's material, the actor illusion effect allowed us to get into Makoto's head far faster thanks to the use of common vocal tics and inflections between both characters. And the knife edge of a tsundere, more present in the far more insecure Mikoto, still seen as a subtle sliver in Makoto during every interaction we've had with her. That is part of why An and Ryuji find such danger in her and don't write her off as an incompetent like they do the teachers, as that scalpel settled into her voice permits her to command a room if she so wishes. Thus why such subservience to the coward that is the Eggman would seem so out of character, were it not for the game making us aware of him, holding the possibility of her future and her sister's well-being in his hands.
囚人学園の生徒会長ですって。誠が怪盗団騒ぎに首を突っ込んでいたっていうの。
But backed into a corner as she is, Makoto decides to take a gamble and stops self-sabotaging herself, keeping a recording device on her as she spies on her primary suspects, until the point An and Ryuji are stupid enough to mention they are phantom thieves.
レコーダーか。証拠にしては不十分な気もするが。
Tell that to the Black Knights 3/4 of the way through Code Geass R2. Once again, there is a reason that plot is so ridiculed, and everyone that echoes that series handles that matter much better to call out its bullshit. But yeah, right then and there, she has them dead to rights, with no need to even reveal to them that she has this information that she could right then and there turn over to Kobayakawa to get off of her back. And yet, she doesn't, instead revealing the existence of the recording to them for one reason alone. She has no idea whether doing so is truly the right thing.
だから確かめさせて。あなたたちの言う正義を。
Because Kobayakawa is once more ignoring the plight of the students and their suffering. He, despite being an authority figure, does not present himself as a just arbiter, as he's abandoning his position's duties and doing everything to shift the blame to others when the buck should stop with him. This belief only reinforced because Kobayakawa's conduct has poisoned himself towards Makoto, insisting on dragging her name through the mud as a scapegoat that failed them, instead of him, in order for the animosity the school would then feel towards her to try and invoke peer pressure to isolate her from them, just so she would have no choice but to turn back to Kobayakawa himself. And it doesn't work, because Makoto is the fucking adult in the room and is intelligent enough to see this manipulation for what it is. And if she were to concede to it, that would be all she'd ever do throughout her life going forward. Whereas despite holding no formal position themselves, the self-described thieves before her lack any criminal intent to commit harm. Thus it's questionable whether, legally speaking, they would even fit the grounds to be charged with the conspiracy to commit a crime. Thus everything Makoto's awareness of the law is telling her that she's been arguing with herself over for the past month is, are they really in the wrong? Or are they just being blamed for fixing a problem the adults should have done themselves? As if it's the latter, she has no moral reason to oppose them and would happily side with them instead. We're obviously ignoring here that the supernatural would not be explicitly covered under any rule of law the real world in this setting would be governed by. At best, the thieves would be charged with compelling the confessions of the individuals under duress. As part of the legal text for a duress charge includes language that covers any form of psychological manipulation, torture, or brainwashing that may force someone to act contrary to their wishes or best interests. Those laws written in such ways that would count any supernatural means or future technology that would allow for such mind control. That is in fact what Sai's entire case with the psychological breakdowns is hinged upon. The matter of who caused that state of duress. However, as I've already explained, the removal of the distortions is not causing a state of duress. It is acting to remove such a state, with the consequences of that being that the weight of their sins is then left behind, as their conscience is no longer being locked up and ignored. The duress that then causes their confessions or reformations is consequently self-caused, and not something the thieves can be charged with invoking. It is instead the one who causes the distortions to begin with that creates the duress which causes the subsequent crimes and guilt. There is legal precedent with that too, with criminals that were found to have brain tumors or other mind-affecting sicknesses, whether they be viral, bacterial, or parasitic, that once the condition was cured, experienced differing emotional responses towards the actions they had previously committed, which made a case for a lightening of their sentences. Or in America's case, it used to, but mental health regulations were butchered in the 1980s thanks to former President Ronald Reagan after a mentally unwell man assaulted him. And he and his supporters were very unhappy the sick individual got a lightened sentence even though his treatments cured him of any psychotic or criminal impulses to allow that man to properly reform and pay penance for his actions. That he wasn't just locked up forever in a cell led to the legal gutting of mental health funding, which led to psychiatric treatment of criminals to become a revolving door of people who need help being failed by the system, only to relapse again, thus stigmatizing any form of mental health problem as inherently wicked, while also creating a double standard with regards to mental health diagnoses being used by rich assholes with clear intent of their criminal actions to abdicate all responsibility for a crime, which it's not supposed to be used for. You still did it, and the condition being cured should be contingent with regards to release in order to prove such a mitigating factor was not fabricated. But back on point, because they don't know the means or method of what's causing the breakdowns, neither the Nijima sisters can make a judgment for or against the Phantom Thieves out of hand. And it's only because of later story events, where Sai is not in the know, that she actively turns against them. Thus, once we get past on wrongfully guilting Makoto for the state of Shiho thanks to Kobayakawa's scapegoating, which I already explained she couldn't have done nothing about, as she had no power by which to intervene, and I really hate that so many fans of this game miss that An is completely in the wrong here, and making idiotic assumptions based on Kobayakawa's lies. Makoto gives the thieves an offer. Prove their justice to her, prove that they had no other choice and were in the right to intervene how they did, and their methods do not involve any form of coercion to those they target, and she'll destroy the recording she has. For if they are truly righteous thieves as they claim, then they'd have no problem helping her stop the abuse of more students at Kaneshiro's hand. So this is a bit of a tangent again, and involves something I've discussed in the past. For those who are newer around here, I used to be a tokusatsu reviewer. In case that wasn't obvious from the toys I've been showing off, the references I've been making, and the fact I have an entire shelf full of Gao Ranger figures up there. I stopped years ago due to a combination of reasons, but most essentially being I disliked a lot of what the toku genre was doing at the time, and me voicing that was getting me death threats. But from that, I found if I was just going to hate on everything, it was time for me to step back before I turned into one of the hateful monsters that were screaming at me anyways, as it was a waste of what little time I had. Distance from the event has shown that was a good decision on my part, and the position I had voiced ended up being vindicated. I do miss the view count it used to provide me, though. I mention this because Persona 5's immediate widespread popularity with audiences in big and small ways had a knock-on effect to other media around it. One More Lupin III series were already in production by the time this got out, so I can't say Lupin Part 5 came out because of this game. It did consequently inspire Toei to use such as part of the basis for their own series themed after the rivalry between cops and robbers. With the 43rd Super Sentai series released in 2018, Kaito Sentai Lupin Ranger versus Kaito Sentai Pat Ranger. And Lupat, as it's known in its shorthand, is a mess. Part of that is because of the series' head writer, Junko Kimura, being outright terrible with long-form arcs and characterization when it is not contingent on condemning one character to prop up another. And doing that in the first place can be infuriating as well. She is quite bad when there is not someone else above her demanding revision, and has been one of several individuals responsible for the consistently worst decade Sentai's ever had, due to how many Sentai series produced after Gokaiger are just plain bad. Komura having written 3 of them. The other, larger part of that is the entire series was one massive popularity contest between the two competing teams. To avoid Toei striking this video, I'm going to avoid using explicit clips of the moments that damn the series, though it literally does start from the first episode and never stops. But as a viewer, the consistent problem with the cast was the Pat Ranger, who were acting as police officers, had no legal grounds by which to attack and attempt to arrest the Lupin Ranger, who were acting as deputized recovery agents for a collection of stolen relics, which was something other previous Sentai series had done themselves. And atop that, had committed no crimes. Like, literally none. At least not any that they could have legally been charged with that did not equally apply to any other Sentai team, including the Pat Ranger themselves. Their cause for persecuting them was solely based on them stylizing themselves aesthetically as thieves, despite, again, them being legally contracted by their benefactor to receive stolen goods, a benefactor that was already cooperating with and supplying the police as well, so was within his rights to hire additional private agents, meaning the officers were acting under their own discretion, choosing to attack an allied group for no other reason than their appearance. As you can imagine, this has not helped the series with age, nor even its original reception. As this immediately defeated the point of the entire popularity contest framing gimmick, as the poll instantaneously swung overwhelmingly in the Lupin Ranger's favor, and never left it due to their unlawful persecution being what got audiences on their side. To the point that all series long, the only times the Pat Ranger ever had a positive showing was when the Lupin Ranger were explicitly depicted as selfish assholes completely out of character to their presented actions, motivations, and empathy. And even then, the Pat Ranger in those episodes came off as the larger jerks because they'd usually forced the Lupin Ranger into that position of being antagonistic or apathetic. Literally, the only way to make the other side look good was for the storytellers to commit explicit character assassination towards the side that had the people behind them. And it frequently backfired metatextually, as it kept buying into and seeking to excuse the very abuses of power that Persona 5 itself and other media which inspired Lupat had acted to call out.
邪魔をしないでくれって言っただろ。助けて、助けて。
あれが神林さんの考える正義ですか。あれがやりたかったことなんですか。
And I bring this up here because the same question and challenge by Makoto, is that what you call justice? And show me what justice means to you, is the Damocles sword that hung over that entire series, as they never attempted to seriously answer it on either side beyond the petty squabbling that kept being dragged into. Show what that meant for the cast to inform the actions they committed. as if they ever did so, that would have defeated the point of the popularity contest by explicitly framing one team over the other as being in the right, despite the audience from episode 1 having already made up their minds from the moment the officers chose to attack the thieves instead of the monster of the week that had been harming innocent people. Which, of course, led to the thieves in turn retaliating, with both of them looking worse and worse as the series went on, because their infighting kept doing more harm to the characters' depiction as opposed to acting to develop them. And no one realized how detrimental it was to call the whole thing off earlier than planned. And because none of the animosity built over the series was ever settled, when they eventually did reach where the contest would end, the entire reason for them coming together was seen as shallow and unjustified, as the Pat Rangers series-long persecution had been from the start. Now, I bring this up not just because Toei fucking up with Sentai for the majority of a decade worked to heavily ruin the franchise, and me calling that out used to get me much better views, or Persona's influence in inspiring that specific series, but because I'm reminded of how deeply that series missed the point that is made as part of Makoto's arc every time I revisit this section of Persona 5's story. As it's not enough for you to claim that you stand for something, you have to show with your actions and how you present yourself that your acts are just. The second that is taken away from you, as Kobayakawa now has done to Makoto, you'll never be able to convince people that you have their best interests at heart. As I have already exampled by the case of Torinosuke's situation earlier, but is also showcased through the Code Geass parallels with what happened to Lelouch. By the way, that is why I put Torinosuke's Confidant in this video. I could have placed it elsewhere, but it fit more thematically here, as it reinforces the point. With the Pat Ranger, the audience was wildly against them from the start, for no other reason than their own conduct, and nothing they did ever earned back that lost goodwill. But here, we see that from a more empathetic angle, where then people still missed it. But that was more due to localization issues of this chapter in specific, and those not paying attention who thought it all about her usefulness, when usefulness is not part of the core issue. Because Makoto's frustration at all this bullshit is tangible with how short her emotional fuse is becoming throughout. As to even uncover Kaneshiro's name, we have to find his current victims and interrogate them to learn the circumstances of their blackmail to his mafia. Then we end up having to perform a sting operation that, out of just Makoto's sheer impatience to be done with this, she unintentionally steps into Ren's operation to learn the man's name, unwilling to step back and be uninvolved while we do all the work. As since Kobayakawa abdicated his responsibilities to her, she's been hit from all sides by slander and expectations it is impossible to meet. Not just from the students, not just from the teachers, but even at home, she has no reprieve, as Kobayakawa's also tricked Sai into thinking Makoto has worse problems than she does, which she buys into so easily as Sai's own casework, some of which is being tied to prosecuting some of Kaneshiro's victims that have come to their attention when Kaneshiro forces them to break the law, is such a hassle, she has no time to consider anything other than what she's been told. And Makoto knows of her sister's stress, so doesn't want to worry her at all due to the sacrifices Sai has already made for Makoto. The Nijima sisters' parents are both dead, Sai having been forced to take Makoto in after their father, a police officer, died in the line of duty 3 years ago amidst trying to get evidence to take down gang activity in Shinjuku. And she's struggled to make ends meet for them ever since, even with her job as a high-level prosecutor, because Japanese corporate sexism makes it so she's not paid as much as she should be, because she's a woman in a career traditionally dominated by men, who consequently are not given any of the slack her co-workers are afforded, and also in how pay grades are determined by seniority in Japan, not just the position you hold. And her only taking the job 3 years before means her seniority is consequently low. Makoto does her best to not make any problems for Sai, and works hard to make it so she won't have to rely on her at all after she graduates. But after 3 years of Sai being treated like crap by her superiors, just to make ends meet for them, the emotional support and well-being between the sisters is just not there anymore. I bring this up as the stress Sai is under and her lashing out at Makoto for it is a leading focal point for parts of the direction of the plot as well. The same in how I brought Sai up previously in regards to how the conspiracy plotline highlights her. But it's through Makoto we get to know her outside of the professional perspective, to see how this purported antagonist is just as human as the rest of them and capable of making mistakes, including her false presumptions about Ren in the flash-forward segments. Narratively, this makes Makoto the deuteragonist of the game's storyline because she acts as the narrative counterpoint to Sai herself. You could not tell these parts of the tale anywhere near as effectively without Makoto's direct involvement, due to her experiencing the same form of persecution as Joker himself does, blamed for things they never did, and a false expectation to have a purported use to have value as a human being one she chafes against. For as I got into earlier this year in the Code Geass review, the deuteragonist of the story isn't just the entire group of members in a team ensemble. They are the second most important character to telling the story. The one who has a story that could be told independently of the protagonist, whose focus could supersede the role of main character in the event the original protagonist should die, or possibly have them excluded from the story to begin with, to have just the deuteragonist as the protagonist from the start. You get that from Makoto. And it is fucking irritating that the toxic Persona fans keep insisting she's the worst character of them all in this game and claim she has no story role. It's like, did you even pay attention? 'Cause I'm betting that's a no. Anyways, we finally get the lead we need from Oya, the reporter we met before, about Kaneshiro, and his apparent operational impunity. Confrontations with Sai and An in rapid succession finally being the straw that breaks the camel's back, which lets Makoto's rage burn through her self-control. Thus, it ultimately ends up being An's fault for what happens next. For the thieves find to get to Kaneshiro's palace, due to the nature of his distortion making it appear he's untouchable, they need to punch into Kaneshiro's head that he isn't as immune as he thinks he is. It's just in Makoto's rage, she turns reckless, and becomes the new target of Kaneshiro's blackmail as consequence. All because An couldn't stop being a bitch to her for things she wasn't responsible for 5 fucking minutes to actually allow them to plan this shit out. I feel like I'm more harsh towards An for all this, simply because the fandom tends to let her off scot-free for all of her screw-ups in this game. Makoto was working with and alongside and being involved in all of this, to the point in a previous scene before this she was already endangering herself by working alone, something she would have had to do anyways to try and sell this to Kobayakawa's ridiculous blame-shifting expectations, only for Ren to pull her out of that as well. Thus, I don't get anyone who thinks this is all about her self-worth or thinking she's useless as the crux of it, as it's not. She got so angry about this in the first place because she was already going above and beyond the call of action, only to at no point have that fucking recognized. Kaneshiro's blackmail takes the form of Makoto being kidnapped and dragged into a club with beer and cigarettes strewn everywhere, and due to the perception filter effect making it impossible for anyone to blame the actual culprit for such circumstances, it would appear to an outsider that Makoto and everyone that came to rescue her, namely us, were here voluntarily and it was a good Samaritan, i.e. Kaneshiro himself, that would do their diligence of informing the proper authorities. It's questionable if Kaneshiro knows enough about the other dealings of the conspiracy to know whether Shujin is under their control, or whether Kobayakawa is one of their agents. Though by factoring other aspects in, this looks to be the perfect frame job. The suspicion that this was planned is there because he only began to target Shujin's students after the collapse of Kamoshida's palace. So either Kamoshida's palace being there insulated them from Kaneshiro's influence, or more sinisterly, and what I and others believe to be true, is the conspiracy put the suggestion in his head to direct him in doing so. For due to Kobayakawa's involvement in this, the dots do connect. Makoto's told to find the thieves by members of the conspiracy as they messed with their operations, and want to crucify them as scapegoats for everything they are doing. She drags her feet as she doesn't agree, and then she's browbeaten in circumstances that would leave her in debt to another of their benefactors, which would force her to compromise her ethics in order to appease them, or be bought out of her debts by them as her saviors? No, that is too huge a series of coincidences, especially when you consider that this is the exact same way that the conspiracy got their hands on Sai as their pet prosecutor to begin with. The circumstances around her father's death 3 years before led to any money that should have gone to his kids not being given to them, leading to the financial circumstances that has left them struggling now. And I checked. Japanese police officers are counted as part of the nation's government pension plan, so as the beneficiaries of his pension after death, they should have gotten something, even if it's distributions given over time, to not make Sai suffer the burden she does to keep them afloat. Unless it was a situation like the one shown in this article from Asahi Shimbun that details incidents where the pension was claimed as a deemed inheritance, which is a law that has been seeing abuse over the course of the last decade to literally steal all of a deceased beneficiary's money, as pension plans are explicitly exempt from taxation under that law. But just try telling that to Japan's National Tax Agency. And considering the legal agony I've gone through since 2020 trying to settle my mother's estate after her death, as of recording this video, it's still not over with and they're not letting me have the money thanks to a fucking timeshare trying to claim debts accrued post-fucking-mortem, which is as illegal as it gets, I've never quite emphasized with such an experience more. While the article I'm citing more refers to survivor pensions collected by Japanese citizens from overseas sources, it still legitimizes this in-story as something the conspiracy could have exploited to be able to gain size and assets and use her however they wished, while setting Makoto up at Shujin to possibly indoctrinate her as another pawn for them as well, if Kobayakawa's prior actions with her were meant to be indicative of grooming her for a role they'd planned for her. Hell, considering Kaneshiro himself operates out of Shinjuku, is considered untouchable by the police by him accidenting away anyone that tries, and the sister's father dying in an auto accident when a truck driver mysteriously died after they collided with him, right after he was about to make an arrest, it's popular speculation among the fandom that the mob boss that Officer Nijima was after was Kaneshiro himself. The conspiracy saved him to put him in their debt so Kaneshiro would be one of their financial backers, and then seeded his palace by which to make him their gluttonous money tickets. And, let's face it, it's a lot less suspicious for an officer to die in an accident caused by a man suffering a mysterious death that can be faked as a drug overdose than the officer themselves suffering a mysterious death in the midst of an investigation, as the latter leaves more of a paper trail someone else can pick up. The problem with that speculation is, of course, the timeline conflict, which says the conspiracy only formed after they got access to the metaverse 2 years ago. But by that factor, it then draws into question why Kaneshiro would be one of the financial backers of the conspiracy, as he is later revealed to be, which warranted him his palace, if he has no reason to associate with them to be drawn into their influence. Unless, of course, the conspiracy goes back farther than 2 years to 3. Making it so Officer Nijima's death is orchestrated by them, then kills 3 birds with 1 stone, netting them Kaneshiro and Sai's services, while getting rid of a cop they can't corrupt. But the timeline argument of 3 versus 2 is why we can't confirm this. I generally feel, however, that the game gets more by the conspiracy being involved in this as well than if they were not, for things we have not discussed yet. So this circumstance that really is Anne's fault for provoking Makoto into acting so recklessly gets them to just bring her along while they attempt to next infiltrate Kaneshiro's palace. Makoto immediately catching on to how the metaverse works, thanks to everyone providing a much better explanation than Morgana does. And since she's in debt to Kaneshiro now, she can be used as the means by which to access the flying palace that is a bank. Man, this is the weirdest UFO ending to a Silent Hill game yet. The infiltration goes horribly bad, as despite being consumed by his worst impulses, the man that Kaneshiro is not stupid. And to run con games as long as he has to always stay one step ahead of his enemies and lure them into traps. Thus, the Phantom Thieves walk right into one and trip the security level immediately to his maximum. Shadow Kaneshiro and his minions swarming the thieves, planning to execute the rest, but leave Makoto alone. Because he and his benefactors can profit off of her working for them in the real world. This being another sign of his greater involvement with the conspiracy. That, and his awareness of her sister, and her position. And things Makoto herself is not privy to, and how they're using her for their own benefits. As well as the lie they told her as well.
我慢して言いなりになってればいいの。我慢言いなり。その頃はお前の人生も何もかもめちゃくちゃになってるけどな。
さっきから黙って聞いてりゃ。うぜんだよ、この成金が。
え？
And this is why I've been emphasizing Makoto's arc in the way I have been. Because it really is not contingent at all on whether she's useful to others at all. That's an entirely different complex irrelevant to everything the game is actually doing. And I am dead certain, from every fucking forum post I've had to scroll through ridiculing her, that those that believe she's a horrible character are the ones convinced that it is, when it's not. What is being made most important in this arc is her sense of morals, ideals, and justice. Everyone around her just telling her to shut up, keep your head down, and obey. Compromise your beliefs just to get by in this world, and not upset your betters. And that's what sets her apart from all the others, as she disagrees. Because throughout these events, she's resisted, she's disobeyed, she's been rebelling all this time against just falling in line. Because her not doing so would betray everything she believes in. What this arc has been showing is, no matter what the principal insists, no matter what society declares, no matter what her sister says, no matter what situation she finds herself in, she will not bow. She will not break. She will not let other people tell her what is right when everything she knows says they are wrong. She will not sell out. And she will not compromise her beliefs just to do as she is told. Because her sense of justice is not for sale. She is mad as heck and she is not going to take it anymore.
もう絶対に弱音なんて吐かない。飛ばすだけ飛ばすから。いいよね、ヨハンナ。普段おとなしいからって調子に乗るな。もう猫かぶるのやめたの。行くよ、ヨハンナ。フルスロットル。
Well, if she insists.
Persona. ヨハンナ。いざ。
あ、世紀末橋先輩チース。
Really? Really?
叩かれたいの?
Makoto demolishing the entirety of Kaneshiro's guard allows them to exit the palace before her post-Persona awakening exhausts her completely. But now having seen the metaverse herself and the malice of the distorted palace rulers, she is fully on their side, even a bit freaked out by the possibility that she may have not just been influenced, but turned into a person like that herself had she been in the wrong situation beforehand. As Kaneshiro's taunting has her concerned that Sai may be more involved than she thought due to her own role in the Phantom Thief and breakdown cases. But that's for later. First, they have to deal with Kaneshiro himself.
叩き潰してやるわよ。私を怒らせたこと、必ず後悔させてやる。
我は汝、汝は我。汝、ここに新たなるちぎりを得たり。ちぎりはすなわち、囚われを破らんとする反逆の翼なり。我、助教皇のペルソナの生誕に祝福の風を得たり。自由へと至るさらなる力とならん。
Makoto Nijima, Phantom Thief call sign of Category Queen, just to further reinforce the existing Code Geass character illusion even further, by even their nickname effectively being the same. As anyone watching this should have been able to guess, Makoto is the Kalon Kozuki equivalent in this game, albeit with her school role of student council president being lifted from Millie Ashford's, and her relationship with Sai echoing Euphemia Lee Britannia's with her sister Cornelia. Though that as much is mixed in with and can be substituted for that of their sibling from the Oz the Reflection manga, Maribel Mel Britannia, whose own personality echoes elements of Makoto's own in being a strategist who focuses her attention on counter-terrorism activities and dismantling criminal syndicates. As a consequence of this, anyone who's been seeing the story parallels I and others caught in this game consider Makoto as one of, if not the best girl of the game, and the true waifu of the Paramore tree. Though that again is contingent on one not misunderstanding the game, her story and arc in it, and seeing past the localization issues that have mangled her portrayal for many, and as repeatedly said, created the toxicity around her character's reception. Playing the game with the Japanese audio instead of the English one really does affect the perception that much to correct the misconceptions, just because of how strong a portrayal Rina Sato gives off, once again, because she played Makoto as a more mature, adult, and self-controlled version of Mikoto Misaka, which is in turn the actor typecasting subversion for Rina due to her propensity to portray tsunderes, or characters with shorter fuses to them, such as Rei Hino, aka Sailor Mars in Sailor Moon Crystal, or otherwise having to be the adult in the room, corralling a bunch of eccentrics, such as with her role as Negi Springfield in the Negima anime, Console A in Xenoblade Chronicles 3 Future Redeemed, or her debut role as Prim Snowlight in Divergence Eve. Bonus points for her being the selected Paramore though? The guide I used for the game ended up making the optimum day to do her rank 9 event, where you can flag her as a Paramore, be scheduled for my birthday. It's not a hard flag for anything, but I felt that was a personal win. Her persona Johanna is based upon Johanna Anglicus, the woman who in the Dark Ages was briefly elected to be the Pope of the Christian faith, known as Pope Joan. Fact about her has been obfuscated over the years, but the common story is she was a talented, educated woman who was persecuted in her era for being a woman in a position of power, where just that itself was wrongfully viewed as an unforgivable sin. She was forced to disguise her gender in order to use her learned skills to best help others, in defiance of the expected subservience of women in that era. Her abilities in association with the church causing her to rise high in rank and be elected to the position she was, only for her true gender to be revealed and her subsequently murdered, with the church trying to strike her existence from all record. Helped in that thanks to the Dark Ages' notoriously horrid record-keeping following the fall of the Roman Empire that led to centuries of regression and lost knowledge, and changed their rituals to confirm that every pope following this would always be a man. Because institutionalized sexism, thy name is most active organized religions. But enough information survived that such were rediscovered in the 1300s, alongside the evidence of the change in rituals around the time she was said to have lived making it implausible to say that the story of her rise was a complete falsehood. But the specific details have consequently been lost or otherwise confused with those of other accounts, or the assumption of the time period that this happened being wrong. The church itself insisting she was nothing but a legend made up by those wanting to slander the church. But because this is the Christian faith which is routinely built on persecution and hypocrisy, of course they would denounce it. The myth and idea of Johanna, coincidentally, is one of the things that inspired Type Moon's architects to embrace Rule 63ing historical figures, such as Arthur Pendragon, into female versions of themselves, citing such as precedents that in older eras of our history, it would not be that difficult to have a woman hide themselves as a man, or in the event they didn't hide, the egos of those who write history obfuscated the facts to either erase their true gender, or shift the glory of their exploits onto others. But the long and short of it that makes her parallel Makoto, however, is her sense of right and wrong, and desire to help others in contradiction to social norms about one's station, leading to them being persecuted and punished for it. And the fact this has happened outside of the goddamn game, despite her entire story being astoundingly straightforward, only reinforces that point. Though it makes sense that Makoto's Confidant aligns itself with the High Priestess Arcana, because the Priestess itself is based on Pope Jean. What other Arcana would she thus have had? Consequently, the Arcana represents what Johanna herself did, intelligence and inquiry, one who held the silence of speaking in private confidence with another, as well as the wisdom to resolve conundrums and mysteries. Basically, it's the arcana of individuals who seek to solve problems in their lives and the lives of others. Inverted, the reverse priestess represents conceit, ignorant surface knowledge that lacks actual informed intelligence on a subject, and basically just brute forcing a situation to be resolved with no intelligent thought put into it. Basically representing someone who tries to resolve conundrums thoroughly, but when they reach the end of their patience, they tend to snap and solve problems in as blunt and direct a way as they can. Also known as a slow burn tsundere. This is likewise shown throughout her Confidant storyline, where after Kaneshiro's scheme is shut down, Makoto takes advantage of Kobayakawa's abdication of responsibility to her to try and directly solve more problems brought to her attention around the school, and for the student body proactively, not being hindered anymore by what others may think or expect of her, even as this does act to reform her reputation. Eventually, the focus of the story settling around her reconnecting with a classmate and former friend named Eiko, who is in the middle of being manipulated by another man she views as her boyfriend, into a situation where she'd be forced to prostitute herself to cover for his own expenses. The man in question, named Tsukasa, and before anyone asks, no, he does not have a thing for magenta. If anything, he's a rejected Kazuma Kiryu cosplayer. Being a notorious manipulator of women in the district where they work, so he has a full assortment of sugar mamas he cons money out of, before moving on to another mark once they're high and dry. As this is basically a microcosm of Kaneshiro, players of the game have accused the story of being redundant on this matter, and Makoto overstepping her boundaries now by forcing her justice onto others, as they view Eiko as neither needing nor wanting the help, not catching that Makoto herself shows hesitation over interceding, as after reconnecting with Eiko, and actually gaining friends again outside of the Phantom Thieves, she's reluctant to possibly lose that connection, even if it is in order to pull Eiko out of a situation where she is being abused, as she sees how it directly parallels the Kamoshida, Kaneshiro, and Kobayakawa situations she has personal experience with, to know that if this continues, it will end badly, and the need to act before things get worse, even if the other individuals in the situation do not want them to. Yet, idiots who don't pay attention to this think it's about her learning nothing about not knowing when to intercede and her overreaching here just as much as she underreached before, despite the similar circumstances in play where she knows she can act now to prevent worse things happening, as a showcase that she is being more attentive to such when she didn't have the opportunities to intercede before. Which brings to the very basis of the critique of her, why are you criticizing her over wanting to act now when she can, when you condemned her before about not acting when she was not able to? It's been a thing through the past few Persona games that the consistently most misunderstood Arcana character story is the one relating to the Priestess Arcana holder. And considering Persona 4's example of that is Yukiko Amagi, which is the one I fell aground of, I can't exactly disagree with that observation. As I'll reiterate from the first event of Persona 5 though, my critique was more based on how I didn't feel Yukiko was considering all of her options to do both what she wanted and what would be best to help her family. But she made an informed decision which was hers to make. But with Makoto, it's like, you spent the first half of the game criticizing her for not doing enough in situations where she was already doing everything she feasibly could with the information she had, and then you get to her character story, and the criticism is she's being overbearing or interceding when she shouldn't. These are two criticisms of the character that are not compatible with each other, as what she's doing in the character story is exactly what critics of her wanted her to do earlier, but she had reason to not, yet does now. So, which is it? Do you want her to stay uninvolved in everything, or do you want her to do everything she can to resolve situations she sees in front of her? You cannot have both. Hell, because of the obfuscation of cultural context that is part of Makoto's arc, many in the Western audience cannot figure out how a hot gothic punk biker babe riding on a sentient motorcycle becomes associated with nuclear elemental spells. The nuclear element being the second of the new elemental alignments introduced in this game after Joker's curse element. Who then punches the soul out of people when she's not spellcasting can in any way relate to justice, let alone be the manifestation of a rebellious spirit. I, however, can explain that. And it's not just the Callan Kozuki parallels, due to Callan riding the Gurren like a bike due to how its cockpit is set up, or the Gurren's radiation wave surger, or Callan being the Category 1 queen, or even Johanna's persona evolution converting that bike form into a full-on robot. And of course, her beating the shit out of Suzaku. Oh no, while those are all factors and I love those illusions, it's actually quite simpler than that. For you see, Makoto's entire rebel motif is based on Kamen Rider. The original Kamen Rider, mixed with some of the lead motifs of the other entries in that franchise. Case in point again, the bike that transforms into a robot. Hell, her Persona 5 Royal Second Awakening of Agnes, which takes the form of an armored black and gold motorcycle, yeah, that is also a Kamen Rider reference. Fans know the form that is being homaged here very well from Kamen Rider Kuga, where the artifact the Golram combined with title character Kuga's motorcycle as armor, which helps him fight enemies at the point in the series where defeating them caused the monsters to die with the explosive force of a nuclear bomb. The armored motorcycle being used to ram the monsters, stun them, and then evacuate them from city centers so they would not cause disastrous collateral damage when Kuga sends them to hell. And if that wasn't enough, the original Kamen Riders, Kamen Rider Ichigo, Nigo, and V3, were all powered by wind turbine-cooled nuclear reactors. And as a consequence of that franchise, punk bikers in popular media came to adopt an image of being rebels against conformity that nonetheless followed their own sense of morals and justice, one who rebelled against those who would try to force the world to conform to their selfish views of it, and in doing so, make the world go wrong. And Makoto has become a rebel against those specific sorts of monsters. So of course, one who believes so strongly in moral justice would call upon the motives of the fictional heroes of moral justice in Japan. Hell, to show that I'm not just making this shit up, when they're brainstorming names for Makoto's thief alias, they come up with Rider, Witch, Prez, and Queen, alluding to Kamen Riders, the Witch of Britannia title held by Maribel, Cress, Prez, Millie, Ashford, and of course, Queen 1, Callan Kozuki. The game is doing this deliberately. It's just a matter of whether you have awareness of the context to catch it. And unfortunately, a lot of Western fans just don't. I've also been told that Makoto's Phantom Thief outfit is aesthetically more based on characters from the 1983 manga Fist of the North Star, which is a story set on an Earth devastated by nuclear war, as that is another iconic and often referenced in other media series. But honestly, I've never engaged with much of Fist of the North Star's content to have a proper frame of reference to what is which, beyond Ryuji making the reference earlier, validating that perspective in many's eyes. Though even Fist of the North Star is cited as taking some influences from early Kamen Rider with how it stylizes the morality of its characters in a world that has gone wrong. So it could as much be a case of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, where some references that find more originating source from one are more visible to me, while others that more engage with other material accredit such more to them. This is even further emphasized by Makoto's personal interests. For as you interact with her, you learn her favorite guilty pleasure films are not just police procedurals, but in fact crime dramas part of the Yakuza film genre, such as her favorite film, Like a Dragon, directed by Takashi Miike. I reviewed that movie last year for those that missed that. It's a fun film that unfortunately does not include some essential information needed to tell the story. And frankly, the game it is based on is better. Play the Yakuza Kiwami remake if you get the chance. And honestly, it's things like this, little context clues like the Kamen Rider parallel, the Yakuza movie fangirling, and even her and Eiko reconnecting over a cute little mascot character like another Rina Sato character. And all her idols being those who rebelled and chafed against the establishment to follow their own sense of right and wrong, just as her father did, and just as she has in turn. That says to me Makoto's a woman that had to grow up far faster than she wanted to, because she needed to. That had personal tragedy not affected her and her sister, which again is suspected to have been caused by the conspiracy to make Sai their pawn as she became a prosecutor immediately after their father's death, and the way Makoto tells it implies was even handed the job at the funeral. Well, if all of that had not happened, she'd probably be a lot more of a Chunibyo acting out a heroic Knights for Justice routine than she presents herself as being. But that isn't a bad thing, as it's allowed her to carry on her ideals untarnished, and move forward with them by her side, without a naive or ignorant mindset that could make them harmful, because she bears the wisdom to look at the world without being blinded by preconceptions of how the world should be. She sees the world for how it is and wants to make it better. In the same way, all the characters that acted as inspiration for her, both in design of her character and her arc, and internally in the series, found their own ways to. And this once again showcased from how her Confidant arc plays out, with Makoto's arc there being a debate between letting Eiko be happy and oblivious even though it leads her to be abused, or listening to her instincts to intervene and prevent this abuse she knows is happening, even if it is at the cost of a personal relationship. And Makoto, like we've seen before, following through because the right thing in the long term is worth the consequences paid in the short term, even if it's to her personal detriment due to how isolated from people Makoto has been forced to be. There's this similar social link in Persona 3 idiots wrongly think is the better execution of this plot, but the issue with that assertion is the Persona 3 social link is the reverse issue entirely, and they are not comparable in the ways that are being asserted. In Persona 3, the character Hidetoshi Odagiri is a fucking rule hardliner, believing that any mandate needs to be stringently obeyed to as written, with any bending or breaking of, say, a dress code violation requires swift capital punishment, all justified in his mind because he is in the student council of his school. The problem there, as stated before about the fictional depiction of Japanese student councils and stories that involve school settings, is the student council, even in that game, does not have the power of enforcement in the ways that Odagiri is acting in. And thus, Odagiri's conduct is an outright, explicit showcase of an individual abusing the power they believe they have, and the acts of an asshole trying to maintain absolute order when his intervention is in no way needed, wanted, or permissible. And Persona 3's protagonist has to, through that arc, get him to knock that shit off. So I don't in any way get the comparison. When Makoto's character arc is about her refusing to be complacent to things when she has the opportunities to help others in dire straits out of them, when she learns of and sees the need, as well as making sure she keeps her eyes open to injustice so she knows when to intervene. Whereas Odagiri's is about him intruding on others' lives and dressing them down over their shoes being untied and needing to stop that as he has no right in the first place to act like that. These are diametrically opposed extremes started from intent. Makoto's is not to control others, but with Odagiri's it was. Makoto's being about when to reach out to stop abuse, Odagiri's him needing to have it beaten to his head where the boundary line between being abusive and being corrective in line with his duties is, as he needs to stop forcing himself onto others. And I think, unfortunately, that part of this misconception is tied just as much to the gender of the character and the depiction of them in English, causing this disconnect from assholes in the fandom that don't like women telling them off or acting in a position of authority, but are perfectly fine with a guy forcing himself onto others and wielding power they have no right to claim. It's actually my problem with Persona 3 over either 4 or 5. I actually dislike a lot of the social links in Persona 3 because of the bullshit from the characters P3's protagonist connects to, as Makoto Yuki is never given the agency as a character to directly call such misconduct out, but instead has to put up with it. It's why even with the Reload remake of the game that I don't want to review it, as there's a lot of narrative tropes in there that just plain piss me off that other games handled far better. And Makoto Nijima's arc is certainly one of them. But then again, I do my best to pay attention and engage with the media I intake to properly judge them. It's fine if you yourselves are not a big fan of the social link, but as is my thesis, there are so many people who play these games that don't at all try and pay attention to what they're actually doing. And in Persona 5's case, I really do feel that the voice acting was part of creating the detrimental circumstances around them, so many took away the wrong takes from it all. Ultimately, Ren helps her expose the jackass's antics by play-acting as her boyfriend to entice the other man and trying to get her into a con as well, catfishing him to expose what he's doing to Eiko beyond a shadow of a doubt. Eiko admitting in the midst of the intervention that she knew on some level she was being used, but she wanted to have some value to someone to help give her life meaning. And as Makoto rightfully says, that's something she needs to find for herself, just as Makoto did, to live unyielding by the truth of her own convictions, and correct any wrongs that cross her path in any way she can. It explains her eventual ambition to become the commissioner of the Tokyo Police Department as well. She knows there are bad cops part of the system that overlook or even benefit from crimes committed, and she just as much wants to root out that evil ubiquitous to such a system, so the people who just want to truly help others can be exalted and take charge, to in turn properly protect and help those they should. And regardless of whether you romance her or not, Ren's going to be right there with her, helping her along from the shadows brought by someone stepping so openly into the light.
今回のホストもそう。この国には表沙汰になっていない事件が山ほどある。違法スレスレの卑怯なやり方で人の心につけ込んで食い物にしてる悪党。お父さんが命を懸けて追っていた組織もそう。私はそいつらを決して許さない。けどそれを成し遂げるには私一人じゃ無理。だから組織を動かせる官僚になって無法者を根絶して被害者を減らしたい。私の目指す正義だし、お父さんの意志を継ぐことだって思うから。勉強の意味を勉強以外のことで知るなんて不思議ね。付き合ってくれてありがとう。お堅い会長のおもり大変だったでしょなんてね。でもあなたに頼んでよかった。私ね、これからもっと違う世界を見られる気がする。きっとできるわ。あなたがそばにいてくれるから。
我は汝、汝は我。汝ここにちぎりを血明の絆へと転生せしめたり。絆は反逆の翼となりて魂のくびきを打ち破らん。今こそ汝、助教皇の究極なる非業に目覚めたり。無尽の力を汝に与えん。
感じるわ。私の成長した、新しくなった力。
よし。
As for what Makoto brings to the table by being a party member, well, her intelligence affords her shadow calculus, allowing us to see the skills of enemy shadows, and at higher ranks informing us of the elemental resistances of them without needing to experiment out of the blue, massively speeding up battles. Hell, her nuclear spells are so potent, and she's a strong fighter as well, that for me, Makoto becomes an immediate and permanent party member. Because to me, like Lelouch and Callan before them, Joker and Queen are a pair, and only bad things happen if you insist on separating the set. And with the way everything between her and her sister is playing out, there's no plausible way to have made her the traitor in their midst either, though many of the idiots who do not get the intentions of her arc like to claim she was supposed to be. But no, despite the color of her mask, she never was. And the argument is completely fraudulent.
クイーン、いい響き。気に入った。それでいいわ。じゃあ今回の作戦を説明してくれる？
作戦？
ないの？怪盗って無策でやってるわけ？
But that all happens later. In the now, we have to still deal with Kaneshiro's palace, and the bank raid is anything but simple due to the security involved, which would be utterly beyond this group were it not for Makoto's intelligence and persona-enhanced observation skills. I mean, let's face it, Ryuji's not experienced and by his own admissions is not great at book-smart matters. An is a ditz. Morgana's so abrasive that he'd end up tripping up the others by giving warning too late, as he'd expect the others to be perfect at all times, and his excessive berating of Ryuji shows he should not be a party head. Yusuke just know with how often he's off in his own head, and Ren, despite his skills, cannot micromanage this cluster of idiots on his own. Makoto, being the intelligent disciplinarian and second to Joker, makes sense as you know not to talk back to her when a situation is serious, as she takes matters seriously from the start. Still, this is up there with one of my favorite palace infiltrations in the game. Which is surprising as I don't actually like all that many movies or media that are about bank heists. Sure, of the few of the Lupin's films and specials that have that as the end goal are pretty fun. Die Hard with a Vengeance is a classic. The 1995 film Heat includes some of the greatest performances of Robert De Niro and Al Pacino's careers, and I cannot resist the call of young Keanu Reeves in Point Break. But the 3 American films I just named are already on lists of the best movies ever made, so it's not like I'm the only one singing their praises. But me, I'm more an Ocean's 11 kind of guy.
What, you want to knock over a casino?
Honestly, why I like it so much is this entire infiltration just has the right structure of challenge for me as we dive deeper and deeper into the bank and witness Kaneshiro's own gluttonous depravity. And there is argument on whether Kaneshiro's distortion-caused sin is gluttony or greed. And there is another way of addressing the concern, as gluttony makes many think of relating as solely to food. For gluttony in nature is having everything you could want already, and still not finding it sufficient, wanting more of what you already have, just as much as if you don't have anything at all. Greed, on the other hand, is about desire to achieve something, that until you reach that end goal and maintain it, you will not stop. You can be satisfied by that goal, but the reckless abandon and lack of care towards others one can perform to reach it is where the evil of that sin is committed. Kaneshiro, through his criminal empire, is already rich. He doesn't need to be blackmailing and extorting kids to become involved in his drug running and Ponzi schemes if they don't just pay him off. But he can't stop himself from trying to metaphorically devour them because the distorted sin of gluttony has made it so he cannot get enough. When you're greedy, you might still want it all, but retention of what you have can be enough. And as such, the palace is consequently a monument to excess with how vast and empty it is, stuffed with security-protected gluttonous excess that will never be fully filled. At the bottom of the bank is a complex maze designed after a lock tumbler, which guards the source of Kaneshiro's gluttony. But even when we secure a means of entry, the complications arise after sending the calling card to him. For Kaneshiro's cognition is still strong and crafty enough to think he's already well guarded enough that the thieves can't get to him, allowing his palace and shadow to manifest one final obstacle to claiming the treasure, with Shadow Kaneshiro waiting right for us. With him manifesting the power of Baal, and the safe transforming into his trusted Piggytron robot! If I had a nickel for every time I've seen a giant piggy bank robot, I'd have 2 nickels. It's not a lot, but it's weird it's happened twice.
卑怯なことしかできないかわいそうな人よね。
勝ち方に綺麗も汚いもない。クレバーな奴が勝つ。賢く強い者は弱者を食い散らかして当然。ネットの知識だけで世の中悟ったような気になる頭の湧いたクソガキはいいかもだよ。
終わってるこの人。
騙されるのは常にバカだ。バカはそのバカの責任を取らされるだけ。学習しないバカは一生バカなんだよ。バカ。バカバカうっせえな。
For demons to manifest from gluttony, Baal is an odd choice to make as he normally doesn't associate with that sin. In the Ars Goetia, Baal, also known as Baal...
That's it? Just... Baal? As in bocce?
Is the great king of hell, governing the demonic legions as the head of the 72 greater spirits, with the power to literally erase the presence of someone from observation or existence. Some texts translate that power as invisibility, while others interpret it as the power of destruction that Baal has mastered to the point of being able to selectively erase a concept as he chooses, thus being able to destroy perception of one's existence when he so chooses to. I think that's why Baal was chosen as Kaneshiro's demon more than anything, as Kaneshiro's own manifestation of the perception filter was stronger than others to make the police forget he even existed, allowing him to act with impunity while being invisible to the criminal justice system. That's what I take away from this, at least. Though really, the difficulty of this fight is more based around Piggytron, as a bank, being a ridiculously tough enemy, it blasting us with fire which makes Yusuke completely worthless in this battle. Overleveling for this fight if you can manage to is also an asset, just due to the sheer armor thickness that gets in your way of actually smashing the bank. And sadly, no one in this crew thought to pack a hammer. So even staggering the mobile bank is a chore to even eject Bail Kaneshiro from the mech to beat him down face to face. At least after we beat up his, literally named, Thugs for Hire. Huh. You know, in the last year I've ended up picking up every Ratchet & Clank game as stream fodder, and that joke hits differently now. Amusingly, Ryuji ends up having the right idea for a plan, and that the best way to break his momentum is to distract Kaneshiro with his own sin, as he'll chase any shiny thing that catches his eye, allowing us to deliver the final crushing blows we need to. Like the two previous palace rulers, they try, and fail, to shift the blame of their actions onto the victims they harmed. But it's always going to be a bullshit argument.
その青臭い正義感意味あんのかね。やってるやつがもういるってのに。
もういる？
教えといてやるよ。パレスを使って好き放題してるやつが実際にいる。そいつは現実で何が起きようがお構いなし。廃人化に精神暴走何でもありだ。
それはまだらめのシャドウが言っていた。
And oh yes, this is where Kaneshiro spills the beans. Which again feeds into that theory about the conspiracy's assassin being behind Makoto's father's death to protect Kaneshiro, even though the timeline does not agree on that. As otherwise, if the conspiracy is not in any way behind Makoto's father's death, how would Kaneshiro in any way know about this? Yes, this is his shadow, but the shadow is only additionally aware of things related to the metaverse. His original self would need to be aware of their connection to the psychotic breakdowns and mental shutdowns to begin with. Regardless, Shadow Kaneshiro is sent back to his host Sans Distortion to change his heart, allowing us to leave with the treasure. The team take it back to LeBlanc, only to discover the treasure manifested as play money in a gold briefcase, representing how Kaneshiro's entire mental complex was built around building up himself as more important than he was. That's why he could never get enough, as no matter what he did, it would not change how tiny of a man he was.
Is this a joke? This money isn't worth the paper it's printed on.
On the contrary, every bison dollar will be worth 5 British pounds. For that is the exchange rate the Bank of England will set once I've kidnapped their queen.
But with Kaneshiro dealt with and the SU director literally calling the principal to finally show results, which themselves are presented on July 9th, with Kaneshiro's guilt finally falling upon him and him turning himself in, it leads to Makoto's final confrontation with Kobayakawa.
回答は正義である。書いた通りです。
回答が誰か分かったのか？
いいえ、見当も。ただ、前後の事実関係から彼らの主義主張には何ら落ち度はありません。したがって彼らを正義とみなし、調査を終了しました。
そんなはずがあるわけなかろう。
そんなはずがない。ならば、その証拠を見せていただけますか？
後輩が理事を務める大学にせっかくいい推薦の話があったんだが。
必要ありません。実力で勝負するつもりですから。失礼します。
Thus, Kobayakawa has nothing by which to satiate the demands of his superiors. And Makoto? Makoto is finally free.
Gonna be
Unfortunately, these are completely cold because of how long this recording session has actually run. Made these like an hour ago, and yeah, you kinda need to get to them while they're still hot.